Hey folks, I just wanted to make a second video. Most of your feedback is done for your TV studies paper, right? Your draft on a TV show. Get those in if you don't have those in yet. Remember, essentially, you're making an argument, you're evaluating, you're analyzing a TV show, right? A great way I like to think about this is the the TV show, right? The season, right? I would pick a season, right? You're not going to do the whole show. The season is your text, right? Is your book for this paper, right? So I would watch or rewatch a season. I would look for a problem, something that sort of something that stands out or something that asks questions to you, something that bothers you, or something that's really interesting or something that's fascinating, right? Sisterhood on Charmed, or the use of magic in a TV show, or portrayals of parenting, portrayals of drug, anything that you're interested, right? Um, Use of architecture, use of color, use of light, and like anything. Um, and then, right, don't I wouldn't just Google like your show on the wild west of the internet. You're gonna get a bunch of like junk food sources. So I would take your key terms that you're interested in. Have like 3, 4, or 5 key terms. Plug those into Google Scholar. So, for example, my key terms are portrayals of fatherhood on television, TV, entertainment. Okay, so I plug that into Google Scholar, and I get like 15 articles on this, right? And some of them are on a specific show, right? None of them are on the show I'm interested in, right? Which is Bob's Burger, or I'm into the Baby Yoda show, right? Which Grogu, that basically just came out. So there has been nothing written in a sustained scholarly academic historical way on that show. So I could apply any of these articles to sort of The Mandalorian and understanding, fatherhood is portrayed in a very interesting way on that show. Like he's basically like a superhero. He has a kid. Um, he's like masculine, but he's also like very like loving and empathetic and connective. Like he's a very interesting role figure for a father. So yeah, I might take the portrayal of men's family roles in TV, or does father still know best? Right, an analysis of fatherhood on popular TV sitcoms. Right, none of these mention The Mandalorian again. Right, a lot of these articles they take a more sustained look at like TV in general, and so then I want to apply those ideas to my show. Um, that's that hasn't been done before, folks. Right, take one of these articles, apply their ideas to your show. Okay. If you Google euphoria and drug abuse and does it glorify drugs, or does it show the problems with drug culture? There's 1,000 articles on that, right? What are you gonna say? It's already spelled out. It's already proven. It does both, right? So I would try to avoid like, okay, here's my show, right? What has already been said about it, right? The internet will show you that. If you're doing Breaking Bad, yeah, a lot has been written on his narcissism. A lot has been written about portrayals and glorification of drug culture, Latinos on that show. So there's really nothing left to say about that. So I would find something new, like a new angle. Um, so that's another way to work, right? You gotta find a new perspective or a new angle. That's what an op-ed does, right? It gives us this new understanding. Okay. Um, so now let's go to the new. We are on, right, the podcast. You have a one video on your outline for that. So I just want to go over some of the readings this week for the podcast. Um, I've been answering the discussion, so keep checking that out. Right, people have questions about the podcast. I've been answering it. I've been giving some feedback on interviews ideas, the podcasts that you're listening to, which are awesome. So take a look at the discussion. Take a look at making podcasts that matter. 23 examples of short podcasts. I really love this reading, folks. There's 23 short podcasts embedded in here. So when you click on the title of a podcast, right? How the Worst Procrastinator, Sexism at Lillian Osborne, right? The Truth About Your Seatbelt. These are all going to take you to podcast examples, right? And what I like about these is they're all about 5 or 6 minutes, right? We're making a 7-minute podcast. So these are just a really great example for how to make a short podcast, right? How to come in at around 5, 6, 7 minutes. And these are all made by students, right? So I like these because it helps us just release our perfectionism, right? Podcasting began, I love telling the story. I sort of lived through this as well. Podcasting was sort of like an underground grunge phenomenon, right? It was sort of a rebellion against traditional media. These were people in their basements, seriously, making podcasts, right? They did not have $1 million budgets like many podcasters have now, right? Thinking of like the Chelsea Lately podcast. So they're supposed to be raw, they're supposed to be direct, right? They're not supposed to be polished and smooth and perfect, right? We don't have $1 million budgets for our podcast. So let's go back to the roots of podcasting, which is these are raw, no budget, right? These are no budget podcasts that we're making. So try to let go of it has to be perfect or smooth, right? Just let that go. And these examples, right, these student examples will really give you more realistic examples, right? Rather than, picking some of these, the Ezra Klein show or Query or, the Rachel Maddow show, right? A lot of these are big budget productions. Okay, so take a look at that for really good examples. It also walks you through how to think about making a podcast, right? You got to decide on a format. So the discussion this week sort of breaks this down for us, right? I sort of lead us through this, right? We got to pick a format, right? Is it going to be conversational, roundtable? You have to do at least one interview. And folks, you don't have to score like a major interview. So let that go as well, right? Interviewing the people in your lives. I've had students interview their grandparents on gentrification, family violence. I've had families who interviewed their father in a second language to talk about war trauma, PTSD, right? So think about the people in your own life who know a lot of stuff, right? And what experience can they bring to bear? One way to work on this is just like look around your work circle, your friend circle, your family circle. Is there someone in your own life that is deserving of a podcast, right? Like my mother has a lot to say about how women as Marines were treated in the 70s when she was a Marine. Does that make sense? She loves telling the stories of how she would watch the men marching around the base with guns, and none of the women could touch a gun in the 70s on American bases. Women Marines could not touch a gun. So she was very upset. She wanted to play with the guns on military bases in this country, like Pearl Island. So that, right, I would love to tell her story, right? Interview her about that. So think about it that way. Like, is there someone in your life that, right, if you're struggling for a topic, like I want to, help my mother tell her story. I like making my podcast. I love, I've been making home cooking my dog's dog food for over a year now. I love telling that story. I have a podcast about that. So that will be one of my big examples for this class is, okay, I'm telling the story about, I'm educating, I'm informing audiences on, this is how you hand make, home cook your dog's food, right? So it's fresh vegetables, fresh greens, cooked meat, real protein, not cooked flash frozen kibble, whatever, from a bag, processed food their whole life. So that's my podcast topic. And then I also would interview my mother because she's fed our dogs kibble their whole lives. So I'm kind of curious, like, well, why does she do that? So yeah, you don't have to like interview like Bill Gates for this podcast. You just need to find someone who has local knowledge or experience on your topic. Okay. Some other things, you have an outline example, right? So I give you an example of here's my outline, right, for my podcast on Should you neuter or spay your dog? Like I have a lot of opinions about that. Should you hand make their food by hand, right? So that's the outline, my podcast outline example. You have the assignment prompt, right? You can click on that. This has all of your information about, okay, well, how long is the podcast? What do I need to have in my podcast? So take a look at that. Talk about the purpose of this. Why are we doing a podcast? I'll say something to that. Think about it this way. Like literally millions and millions of Americans every day listen to podcasts. Millions and millions of Americans are not reading, academic articles or editorials to get their information. So this is a really popular format for information, for education, for persuasion, right? So I think it's a great format, a real genre, a real style to work within. So I like it for that reason, but I also give, digital literacy. There's a whole host of reasons to think about, let's work in this podcast format, right? So folks, think of it as it is like a paper, right? You are making an outline. We are drafting, right? You need sources, right? We'll get into sources more next week. But essentially, right, there's a writing component to this podcast, which is the outline. I'll ask you to list your sources next week. Right, we're doing the script outline this week. And then we start, I want a sample recording, right, coming up next week. So it needs a beginning, a middle, an end. I, again, would start listening to podcasts and breaking down, well, how did they make that? How did they do that? What was their beginning? What was their middle? What was their end? Okay? That's also part of the discussion this week, is to find a podcast, on a topic that maybe you're also going to do, right? Gentrification, an environmental topic, right? Find a podcast. How do they structure their podcast? Okay. And again, like all the things that are required, right? 7 minutes. Your podcast should sort of give us a new perspective on this topic. Your purpose should be to inform, to educate, maybe to persuade, etc. We're not making entertainment first podcasts. You can use entertainment features you will use sound, audio, music, but that's not the point of the podcast. And again, you need at least one interview, right? And we'll talk about sources more next week, but you need at least one, right? I said you need 3 sources. One needs to be from Google Scholar, right? So think of that as your sort of research component for this podcast, right? If you're doing environmental history, find an article on Google Scholar on environmental history, right? If you're doing the history of, making dog food and kibble and processed food, right? There's a lot of articles on that on Google Scholar. You can see that history. And then, your 2 other sources could be a newspaper, right? Time or USA Today or National Geographic, right? But you need that sort of one Google Scholar source. And then you can bring in a newspaper or a magazine. Okay, so that's essentially this week. You're doing your outline, right? Any questions, folks? Email me. Thank you.